Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. At 74, I thought I'd seen it all. Love, loss, joy, and heartbreak. I believed I was safely settled into the calm, uneventful rhythm of old age. My days were spent in the quiet solitude of my countryside home, surrounded by paintings, the soft hum of my record player, and the distant sound of birdsong. I'd convinced myself I was content, that I didn't need anything more from life. But then Matthew arrived. Matthew is my nephew, my younger sister's son, and he came to stay with me after his life fell apart in ways that felt far too familiar. A failed marriage, a career at a standstill. He arrived at my doorstep with nothing but a duffel bag, a weary smile, and a defeated look in his eyes. I welcomed him without hesitation. I had the space, after all, and it wasn't as though I had much else going on. At first, his presence was a comfort. He brought a liveliness to my quiet home that I hadn't realized I was missing. We shared meals, long conversations, and moments of genuine connection. He reminded me of a version of myself I thought I'd lost long ago, vibrant, curious, and endlessly hopeful. But then something changed. It started small, a lingering glance, a touch that lasted just a second too long. At first I told myself I was imagining things. He was my nephew, after all, young enough to be my son, struggling and vulnerable, looking to me for guidance. There was no reason to think there was anything more to it than that. But late one night, as I sat alone in my studio with a glass of wine in hand, I heard his footsteps outside the door. "Olivia?" His voice was soft, hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he should be there. "Come in," I called, setting my glass down and turning to face him. He stepped inside, his face illuminated by the warm light of the desk lamp. There was something in his eyes I couldn't quite place. Something that sent a shiver down my spine and made my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, the course of my life shifted. This is a story about choices, about the lines we draw for ourselves and what happens when we cross them. It's about loneliness, longing, and the unexpected ways our lives can spiral out of control when we let our guard down. If you're willing to listen, I'll tell you everything. The truth about what happened that night and the nights that followed. I'll tell you how it all began and how it all fell apart. I never imagined myself living alone. Daniel, my husband of nearly 40 years, was supposed to grow old with me in this house. It was our dream, a modest but charming home in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and lush gardens. When he passed away 10 years ago, everything changed. I retreated into myself, finding solace in painting and the predictable comfort of routine. Each day was the same. Coffee in the morning, a stroll through the garden, and hours spent in my studio. My work kept me grounded. Landscapes, still lifes, portraits, all created with the careful precision of someone trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense to them. Friends would visit occasionally, my sister Karen among them. She'd sit at my kitchen table, sipping tea and telling me about her son, Matthew. "He's brilliant," she'd say, her eyes shining with pride. "But he's lost, Olivia. He just hasn't figured out where he fits yet." Matthew was a distant figure in my life, someone I saw at holiday gatherings or heard about through Karen's stories. As a boy, he was precocious and curious, always asking questions and scribbling stories in a worn notebook. As an adult, he became a successful novelist, publishing 3 books by the time he turned 30. But his personal life was less stable. Karen called me one afternoon, her voice strained with worry. "Matthew's not doing well," she said. "His marriage is over, and he's struggling to write. He needs a change of scenery, somewhere quiet where he can clear his head. I was hoping he could stay with you for a while." I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't want to help, I just wasn't sure how to navigate sharing my space with someone again after so many years alone. But Karen sounded so desperate, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. "Of course," I told her. "He's welcome here." When Matthew arrived, I was struck by how much he had changed. The confident, charismatic young man I remembered was gone, replaced by someone quieter, more subdued. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He carried a single duffel bag, the rest of his belongings left behind in the city. "Hi, Aunt Olivia," he said, forcing a smile. "Matthew," I replied, pulling him into a hug. "It's good to see you." His room was ready, a cozy space overlooking the garden. I'd filled it with fresh flowers and a stack of books I thought he might enjoy. He seemed genuinely touched by the gesture, thanking me with a sincerity that made me feel both appreciated and sad for him. At first, we kept our distance. He spent most of his time in his room, working on his laptop or staring out the window. I gave him space, unsure of how to approach him in his obvious state of despair. But as the days turned into weeks, we began to find a rhythm. I'd cook dinner, and he'd join me in the kitchen, offering to help chop vegetables or set the table. We'd sit together, eating in companionable silence or discussing trivial things like the weather or the latest book he was reading. Slowly, he began to open up. "I feel like I've lost everything," he admitted one night, his voice heavy with emotion. "My marriage, my career, it's all fallen apart." I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. "You haven't lost everything, Matthew. You're here. You have a family who loves you, and you're young enough to rebuild." He gave me a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Aunt Olivia. I don't know what I'd do without you." As the weeks went by, our bond grew stronger. We began taking walks together in the mornings, exploring the trails that wound through the hills behind the house. He'd tell me about his childhood, his writing, and the dreams he once had, but wasn't sure he could achieve anymore. "You're so talented, Matthew," I told him during one of our walks. "You've already accomplished so much. Don't give up now." He looked at me with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You make it sound so easy," he said, "but it's hard to see the good in yourself when everything feels like it's falling apart." I understood his pain more than he realized. After Daniel died, I felt much the same way. Adrift, unmoored, unsure of who I was without him. But I had found my way back through my art, and I wanted to help Matthew find his way too. One evening, I invited him into my studio. "This is where I spend most of my time," I said, gesturing to the canvases lining the walls. "It's my sanctuary." He walked around the room, studying my work with an intensity that surprised me. "These are incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've captured so much life." Hearing him say that stirred something in me, a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," I said softly. "Art has always been my way of making sense of the world." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think I need to find something like that again. Something that makes me feel whole." It was during these moments that I began to notice a change in him. He seemed lighter, more present, as though the weight he'd been carrying was beginning to lift. But along with that change came something else. Something I couldn't quite name. It was in the way he looked at me sometimes, his gaze lingering a second too long. Or the way he'd reach out to touch my arm when he laughed, his hand warm against my skin. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than affection, a sign of the closeness we'd developed. But as the days went on, I couldn't ignore the way it made me feel. One afternoon, we were sitting on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset over the hills. The conversation had turned to Daniel, and I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't with anyone since his death. "He was my best friend," I said, my voice tinged with both sadness and warmth. "We built this life together, and losing him, it felt like losing a part of myself." Matthew reached over and took my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "You're incredible, Aunt Olivia," he said. "I hope you know that. Everything you've done, everything you've been through, you're so much stronger than you realize." His words took my breath away. I looked at him, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart race. A mixture of admiration, longing, and something else I couldn't quite place. I quickly pulled my hand away, trying to steady myself. "Thank you, Matthew," I said, forcing a smile. But the moment lingered, unspoken but undeniable. From that day on, the dynamic between us shifted. The easy camaraderie we'd developed was still there, but beneath it was an undercurrent of tension. I found myself more aware of him, of the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into things. But late at night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he made me feel. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he stopped me in the kitchen. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Of course," I said, turning to face him. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with what to say. Then finally he spoke. I I want you to know how much you mean to me, he said. You've been so kind, so patient. I don't know what I'd do without you. His words were filled with emotion, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. You don't have to thank me, Matthew. I'm happy to have you here. But the way he was looking at me, intense, searching, made it clear that there was more he wanted to say. Matthew, I began, my voice trailing off. Before I could finish, he took a step closer, his hand brushing against mine. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I didn't want to name. It was a quiet autumn evening, when the boundary between us blurred in a way that could never be undone. The day had been uneventful, the kind of day that slips by unnoticed in the comforting monotony of routine. Matthew and I had spent the afternoon in the garden, clearing away the last remnants of summer. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the soft light of the setting sun cast a golden glow over everything. As we worked, Matthew seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in weeks. He laughed easily, his earlier melancholy replaced by a warmth that was contagious. You have a knack for this, Aunt Olivia, he said, gesturing to the neatly trimmed hedges and freshly turned soil. It's like you've created your own little world here. I smiled, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. This place has been my refuge. It's kept me grounded, especially after. My voice trailed off, and he nodded, understanding without me having to say more. That evening after dinner, he poured us each a glass of wine, a habit we had fallen into since his arrival. We settled into the living room, the fireplace crackling softly in the background. The house felt warm, cozy, and safe, a stark contrast to the growing unease I felt within myself. It started innocently enough. We talked about books, as we often did. He had been rereading a favorite of his, The Great Gatsby, and we debated its themes: love, ambition, and the elusive nature of happiness. It's tragic, really, he said, swirling the wine in his glass. Gatsby spent his whole life chasing a dream that was never real to begin with. I nodded, thinking of my own life and the dreams I had let go of over the years. Sometimes it's easier to hold on to the idea of something than to face the reality, I said softly. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. Do you ever feel like you've settled, Aunt Olivia? Like you gave up on something you wanted? The question caught me off guard. I took a sip of wine, stalling for time. I don't know, I admitted finally. I suppose there were things I wanted that didn't happen, but I don't regret the life I've had. It's been meaningful. Meaningful, he repeated, his tone contemplative. That's a good word for it. I think I've been chasing the wrong things my whole life, and now that I've lost them, I'm not sure what's left. I reached out, placing my hand on his. You're still young, Matthew. You have time to figure it out. His hand tightened around mine, and for a moment, the air between us shifted. It wasn't until later, when I was alone in my studio, that I realized how much that moment had unsettled me. I tried to focus on the canvas in front of me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Matthew. The way he had looked at me, the warmth of his hand on mine. I told myself it was nothing. A fleeting moment of vulnerability. Nothing more. But then I heard footsteps outside the door. Olivia? His voice was quiet, hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he should be there. Come in, I said, setting my brush down and turning to face him. He stepped inside, his face illuminated by the soft light of the desk lamp. There was something in his eyes, an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Is everything okay? I asked, trying to sound casual. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know, he admitted. I needed to talk to you. Of course, I said, gesturing for him to sit. He didn't sit. Instead, he took a step closer, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. I don't know how to say this, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But I feel like everything in my life is falling apart, and you're the only thing that makes sense right now. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he closed the distance between us. Aunt Olivia? His voice broke, and for a moment he looked so vulnerable, so lost, that I couldn't bring myself to stop him when he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. The kiss was brief, lasting only a moment, but it felt as though time had stopped. When he pulled back, his eyes were filled with both fear and longing. I'm sorry, he said quickly, stepping back. I shouldn't have. It's okay, I interrupted, my voice trembling. You're going through a lot right now. I understand. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. What had just happened wasn't okay, and I didn't understand it. Didn't understand the feelings it had stirred within me. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll go, he said, turning to leave. Matthew, wait. I wasn't sure why I stopped him. Maybe it was because I didn't want him to leave like that, filled with shame and regret. Or maybe it was because a part of me didn't want him to leave at all. He turned back, his expression unreadable. You're not alone in this, I said softly. Whatever you're feeling, we can figure it out together. For a moment, he simply stared at me as though trying to decide whether to believe me. Then he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. We didn't talk about what had happened, but the tension between us was palpable. Every glance, every touch, every shared moment was charged with an unspoken understanding. I found myself more aware of him than ever before. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. It was as though the kiss had opened a door I hadn't even realized was there, and now I couldn't close it. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills, he broke the silence. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? He asked, his voice quiet but steady. I looked at him, surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean, do you ever feel like you've made so many compromises that you don't even recognize yourself anymore? I thought about Daniel, about the life we had built together. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the dreams I had let go of. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit that yes, there were times when I felt exactly that way. Yes, I said finally. I think everyone feels that way sometimes. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I don't want to feel like that anymore, he said. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he had looked at me, the way his words had made my heart ache with both longing and fear. I knew what I was feeling was wrong. He was my nephew, my sister's son. But in that moment, he wasn't just my nephew. He was a man, vulnerable, lost, and searching for something I wasn't sure I could give him. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. The kiss might have been brief, but its impact lingered in every corner of my home. I couldn't shake the memory of it. The warmth of his lips, the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and the way my own pulse had quickened against all reason. But now, in the cold light of day, guilt wrapped itself around me like a suffocating shroud. Matthew was my nephew, and no matter how fractured or desperate we both felt, what had happened was a mistake. For days, we avoided each other. Matthew stayed in his room, only emerging to grab a cup of coffee or a plate of food. I busied myself with my painting, but the strokes on the canvas were aimless, chaotic. I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling back to him, to that moment, and to the unspoken tension that now hung between us like a thick fog. It was on the third day that he finally broke the silence. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of tea growing cold in my hands, when he walked in. He looked hesitant, his usual confidence replaced by something tentative and unsure. Morning, he said, his voice low. Good morning, I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled slightly, betraying the turmoil beneath the surface. He sat across from me, his hands clasped together on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was almost unbearable. Finally, he cleared his throat. Aunt Olivia, about the other night? I held up a hand, stopping him. Matthew, we don't need to talk about it. It was a mistake, a moment of confusion. He flinched at my words, his jaw tightening. Is that all it was to you? A mistake? I stared at him, taken aback by the hurt in his voice. What else could it be? I don't know, he admitted, his gaze dropping to the table. But it didn't feel like a mistake to me. It felt real. His words sent a jolt through me, but I forced myself to stay composed. Matthew, you're going through a difficult time right now. You're vulnerable, and I should have been more careful. Careful? He repeated, his voice rising slightly. You think this is just about vulnerability? About me being lost? Isn't it? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't get it, do you? He said, his eyes blazing. You think I don't know what I'm feeling? That I'm just some broken kid clinging to the first person who's been kind to me? This isn't about that, Olivia. It's about you. Me? I echoed, stunned. Yes, you, he said, his voice softening slightly. You're incredible, and you don't even see it. You've built this beautiful life for yourself, and you've been so kind to me, so understanding. You make me feel alive. His words left me breathless, but they also filled me with dread. This wasn't something we could explore. It wasn't something that could be. Matthew, I care about you, I said carefully. But this can't happen. It's not right. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the pain in his eyes. I understand, he said finally. I'll pack my things and leave. Matthew, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he said firmly. Staying here will only make things worse for both of us. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the weight of his words pressed down on me. Part of me wanted to stop him, to tell him to stay, that we could figure this out together. But another part of me knew he was right. The next morning, he was gone. The house felt unbearably empty without him. For weeks, I wandered from room to room, unable to shake the silence that seemed to echo in his absence. I tried to lose myself in my art, but every canvas I started ended up abandoned, a mess of colors and lines that went nowhere. I tried to distract myself with chores, with books, with visits to friends, but nothing worked. I missed him. One afternoon, as I was weeding the garden, my phone buzzed with a message from Karen. Matthew's staying with a friend in the city, it read. He said he needed time to sort himself out. Thank you for looking after him, Olivia. I don't know what he would have done without you. I stared at the message, my heart aching. If only Karen knew the truth. As the weeks turned into months, I began to find a fragile sense of normalcy. I returned to my painting, though my work had taken on a darker, more introspective tone. My friends noticed the change in me but said nothing, sensing that I wasn't ready to talk about it. And then one day I received a letter. The envelope was plain, with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Matthew's. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, my hands trembling slightly. Dear Olivia, I hope this letter finds you well. I've thought about writing to you 100 times, but I never knew what to say. Even now, I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. But there are things I need to say, and I hope you'll understand. First, I want to apologize for putting you in an impossible position, for making things so complicated. I know I crossed a line, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I also need you to know that what I said that night was true. You've been an anchor for me, a source of strength and comfort in a time when I felt like I was drowning. You've reminded me of the kind of person I want to be, and for that, I'll always be grateful. I've started seeing a therapist, trying to untangle the mess I've made of my life. It's not easy, but it's a start. And I've started writing again too. For the first time in years, it feels like the words are coming from a place of truth, rather than a need to impress or please others. I don't know what the future holds, but I hope we can both find peace in our own ways. You deserve happiness, Olivia. Please don't ever forget that. Thank you for everything. Matthew, I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my face. His words were a bittersweet reminder of everything that had happened and everything that could never be. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, alongside other mementos of my life. It was a piece of my story now, one I would carry with me always. The house no longer felt empty. It felt quiet, yes, but also full of memories, both painful and beautiful. I returned to my art with renewed focus, pouring my emotions onto the canvas in a way I never had before. And though the ache of what had happened still lingered, I found solace in the knowledge that we were both trying to heal, each in our own way. Months passed, and the sharp edges of what had happened began to dull, though the memories still lingered like faint shadows in the corners of my mind. The days grew shorter as autumn gave way to winter, and I found myself retreating more into my art. Painting became my therapy, a way to process everything that had unfolded without needing to speak a word of it to anyone. My paintings changed during this time. They became more abstract, filled with swirling colors and shapes that seemed to dance between chaos and order. Friends who visited my studio commented on the shift, marveling at the intensity and emotion in my work. You've tapped into something deep, Olivia, one of them said. It's like you've found a new voice. They were right, though I didn't tell them why. The events of those months had broken something in me, but they had also revealed something I hadn't known was there. A strength, a resilience, and a capacity to feel deeply, even in the face of pain. Karen called me frequently, updating me on Matthew's progress. He's doing better, she said one evening. He's been seeing a therapist and he's writing again. I think he's finally starting to find his footing. That's good to hear, I replied, my voice steady even as my heart ached. She hesitated before continuing. I don't know what you said to him while he was with you, but whatever it was, it helped. He's different now. Stronger. I didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I had helped him or hurt him more. Winter was harsh that year, with snow blanketing the countryside and frost creeping across the windows. The house felt colder than usual, though I couldn't tell if it was the weather or my own lingering sense of emptiness. One particularly cold morning, as I was sipping tea by the fire, I received a package in the mail. It was from Matthew. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a book, a first edition of The Great Gatsby, one of the novels we had talked about so often during his stay. Tucked inside the front cover was a note. Olivia, I saw this and thought of you. Thank you for everything, for your kindness, your patience, and your wisdom. You mean more to me than I can put into words. Take care of yourself. Matthew, I held the book in my hands, running my fingers over the worn cover. It was a simple gesture, but it brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure, a small but significant step toward healing. The days began to grow longer again, and with the arrival of spring came a sense of renewal. The garden came back to life, the flowers blooming in vibrant colors that seemed to echo the emotions I had poured into my paintings. I started venturing out more, reconnecting with friends and attending local art shows. My work was well received, and I even sold a few pieces, something I hadn't done in years. It felt good to share my art with others, to let it speak for me in ways I couldn't. One afternoon, as I was tending to the garden, Karen called with news. Matthew's publishing a new book, she said, her excitement evident even over the phone. It's coming out this summer. He says it's the best thing he's ever written. That's wonderful, I said, genuinely happy for him. He wanted me to tell you, she added. He said you were the one who helped him find his way back to writing. I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me felt a surge of pride, while another part felt the familiar ache of loss. The summer brought with it a flurry of activity. Karen invited me to the city for the launch of Matthew's book, but I declined. I wasn't ready to face him yet, not in person. Instead, I sent him a letter, brief but heartfelt. Matthew, I'm so proud of you. Congratulations on your new book. I know it will be as brilliant as you are. Take care of yourself. Olivia, I mailed it without expecting a reply, but a few weeks later, I received another package. This time it was a signed copy of his book. The inscription read, "To Olivia, for showing me the way back to myself." The words brought a lump to my throat, but they also filled me with a sense of peace. Life continued, as it always does. The memories of those months with Matthew remained with me, but they no longer felt like a weight I had to carry. Instead, they became a part of my story, a reminder of the complexities of love, loneliness, and the choices we make. I began to see the experience not as a mistake, but as a lesson. It had forced me to confront parts of myself I hadn't wanted to face. The depths of my loneliness, the yearning for connection, and the resilience I didn't know I possessed. And while it had hurt, it had also healed me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills, I thought about Matthew and wondered how he was doing. I imagined him sitting at his desk, pen in hand, pouring his thoughts onto the page with the same intensity and passion he had always possessed. I hoped he was happy. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that I was happy too. The garden was in full bloom that summer, a riot of colors and scents that seemed to celebrate the beauty of life itself. As I walked among the flowers, I felt a sense of contentment that had eluded me for so long. Life is messy and unpredictable, filled with moments of joy and pain, love and loss. But it's also beautiful, and I had learned to embrace it all. The good, the bad, and everything in between. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a warm golden light, I smiled to myself, knowing that I was exactly where I needed to be. I never imagined my life could spiral so completely out of control. Yet here I am, sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, staring at a pregnancy test in my trembling hands. It's positive. For most women, a moment like this would bring joy, maybe a little fear, but joy nonetheless. For me, it's like a noose tightening around my neck. This child isn't my husband Greg's. I already know that without question. It's Ethan's. Ethan. My daughter Chloe's boyfriend. I can't even say it out loud without choking on the shame. It sounds ridiculous, like the kind of scandal you'd read about online and shake your head at. A middle-aged woman with a seemingly perfect family, throwing it all away for someone young enough to be her son. But it happened. I let it happen. I want to tell myself I was weak, that I was vulnerable and lonely, that Ethan made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. But none of that excuses it. None of it changes the fact that I crossed a line no mother should ever cross. Greg and I haven't been intimate in months. Honestly, it's been years since we've truly connected. Our marriage has been more of a polite arrangement than a partnership. We sleep in the same bed, eat at the same table, and keep up appearances for Chloe's sake. But deep down, I've felt invisible for so long that I stopped believing I could ever feel wanted again. And then, Ethan came into our lives. It started innocently enough. He was charming, funny, and effortlessly confident in a way only someone his age can be. Chloe adored him, and I wanted to adore him too. For her sake. But the way he looked at me, the subtle way he lingered during conversations or found excuses to touch my hand, it awakened something in me that I thought was long dead. I should have stopped it the moment I realized what was happening. I should have pushed him away the first time he leaned in too close. But I didn't. I let myself fall. And now, I'm paying the price. I glance at the test again, my chest tightening as the reality sinks in. This isn't just a mistake anymore. It's a secret that could destroy my family, my career, and everything I've spent my life building. And the worst part? I don't know if I can live with the guilt or the desire to keep it all from falling apart. If you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd end up here, I would have laughed in your face. I had everything figured out back then, or at least it felt like I did. A good job, a solid marriage, a bright, beautiful daughter heading off to college. I'd worked so hard to build a life that looked perfect from the outside, and for a long time, I convinced myself it was enough. My name is Miriam. I'm 48 years old and a senior project manager at Tempest Interactive, a gaming company known for its big-budget RPGs. I've spent nearly 20 years climbing the corporate ladder, juggling deadlines and negotiating deals with some of the biggest publishers in the industry. It's exhausting work, but it gave me a purpose, a sense of control over something in my life when everything else felt stagnant. Greg and I met in our late 20s, when we were both fresh out of grad school. He was studying finance, I was building a career in marketing, and we bonded over our shared ambition. For years, we were a great team, focused, practical, and determined to give Chloe the stable home life neither of us had growing up. But somewhere along the way, we lost the spark. At first, it was little things. Greg staying late at the office, me burying myself in work to avoid the quiet tension at home. Then it was bigger things. Missed anniversaries, nights spent in separate rooms, arguments that fizzled into silence instead of resolution. By the time Chloe went off to college, we were practically strangers, living under the same roof. I told myself it was normal, that every marriage goes through phases. But deep down, I knew we were just going through the motions. Ethan came into the picture about a year ago. Chloe brought him home for dinner one weekend, practically glowing as she introduced him. "Mom, this is Ethan," she said, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. "He's a developer. He's freelancing right now, but he's working on a portfolio for Tempest." He was polite, charming, and far too handsome for his own good. He had this easy confidence that felt magnetic, like he could step into any room and own it without even trying. I liked him immediately. How could I not? He made Chloe happy, and that was all that mattered to me. Or at least, that's what I told myself at first. But then there were the small things, the little moments that made me start to notice him in ways I shouldn't have. It started as nothing, really. A lingering glance across the dinner table. A comment about how young I looked for my age. His habit of finding excuses to sit next to me during family game nights, his leg brushing mine under the table, just enough to make my pulse quicken. I thought I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into his casual charm. But then Chloe invited him to join us for a weekend barbecue, and everything changed. Greg was working late, as usual, so it was just the three of us. I'd spent most of the afternoon in the kitchen, trying to keep myself busy, when Ethan wandered in to help. "Chloe's on the phone with a friend," he said, leaning casually against the counter. "Mind if I keep you company?" "Sure," I said, my voice overly bright as I chopped vegetables. We made small talk at first, but then he stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body against my side. When I glanced up, his eyes were locked on mine, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You really are stunning, you know," he said, his voice low enough that it felt like a secret. I froze, the knife still in my hand, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Don't," I said, shaking my head and forcing a laugh. "I'm old enough to be your mother." "You don't look it," he replied, his smile never wavering. After that, it was like a switch had flipped. I started noticing everything. The way he watched me when he thought no one else was looking. The way he always found a reason to touch my arm or brush past me. When Tempest Interactive put out a call for freelance developers on a new project, Chloe encouraged Ethan to apply. I had no idea he was interested until the day he walked into my office, flashing that same infuriatingly confident smile. "Small world, huh?" he said, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the place. I should have asked for a transfer right then and there. But I didn't. I told myself I could handle it, that I was being ridiculous. He was just a young man looking for an opportunity, and I was a professional. But the truth was, I liked having him there. I liked the way he made me feel, seen, wanted, alive. Things escalated faster than I could have imagined. Late nights at the office turned into long conversations about everything and nothing. He'd linger after meetings, finding excuses to stay just a little longer. And I let him. Then came the night we worked late on a pitch for a major client. Greg was out of town on a business trip, and Chloe was at her apartment. The office was empty, the glow of computer screens casting soft shadows across the room as Ethan sat beside me, his knee brushing mine under the table. "You worked too hard," he said, leaning back in his chair and studying me with a look that made my stomach flip. "Someone has to," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He smiled, that same infuriatingly knowing smile, and before I could stop him he reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt electric. I froze, my breath catching as his fingers lingered just a moment too long. "You're incredible, Miriam," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know that, right?" I should have told him to leave. I should have ended it right there. But I didn't. Looking back, I can see how easily it all fell apart. How one moment of weakness turned into something I couldn't control. And now, here I am, sitting in my car, holding a secret that could destroy everything. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness I could bury and never repeat. But the truth is, the second it was over, I already knew there'd be a next time. It was late, well past 10 p.m., and the office was empty. Ethan and I were finishing a pitch presentation for one of Tempest Interactive's biggest clients. The kind of deal that could make or break a project. Greg was on another business trip, and Chloe was texting me pictures from some new cafe she and her friends had found, completely oblivious to how far I was falling. We'd been working in my office for hours, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. At some point, I leaned back in my chair, stretching to relieve the ache in my shoulders. "You need to relax," Ethan said, watching me from across the desk, his eyes catching the dim light from my computer screen. "I'm fine," I replied, though my body betrayed me with the deep sigh that followed. He stood and walked around the desk, stopping behind me before I had a chance to react. His hand settled on my shoulders, firm but gentle, and I froze. "You're tense," he murmured, his voice low and close to my ear. My first instinct was to tell him to stop, but the words caught in my throat. The warmth of his hands on my skin sent a jolt through me, something I hadn't felt in years. "Ethan." I started, but he interrupted me. "Just let me help," he said, his thumbs pressing into the knots in my shoulders. It felt too good to stop him. The stress of work, the strain of my marriage, the years of feeling invisible, it all melted away under his touch. And then his hand slid lower, brushing the edge of my collarbone, and I knew I was crossing a line I couldn't come back from. He turned the chair toward him, his hands moving to cup my face. His eyes searched mine for a moment, as if giving me one last chance to say no. But I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, but it didn't stay that way for long. The weeks of stolen glances and unspoken tension ignited in an instant, and before I knew it, we were tangled together in a way I hadn't been with anyone in years. I went home that night, feeling equal parts exhilarated and horrified. I showered until the water turned cold, scrubbing my skin as if that would erase what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was over, that it would never happen again, the memory of his touch stayed with me. And of course, it wasn't over. The next time was in the parking garage. It was late again, and we were the last two people in the building. I'd told him to go home hours ago, but he stayed, waiting for me by my car with that same infuriating smile. "You can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling as I glanced around the empty garage. "Doing what?" he replied, stepping closer. "You know what?" I said, my back pressed against the driver's side door. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and I felt my resolve crumble. "Say the word, Miriam, and I'll stop." But I didn't say it. I let him kiss me again, his hands sliding under my blazer, his body pressing against mine as the cold metal of the car door bit into my back. Every logical thought in my brain told me to stop, to push him away, to think of Chloe, of Greg, of everything I stood to lose. But logic had no place in the moments I spent with Ethan. After that, it became a routine. Stolen moments in my office after everyone had left for the day. Quiet meetings in my car parked in empty lots. Once, at my house, while Chloe was out with friends and Greg was on yet another business trip. That time was the riskiest, and it still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. Ethan had shown up uninvited, texting me from the driveway. "Let me in. Just for a minute." I should have said no, but I didn't. I let him in, and within seconds, we were wrapped around each other in the living room. The thought of Chloe walking through the door at any moment only seemed to make it more intense, the adrenaline heightening every touch, every kiss. When it was over, I told him it couldn't happen again. He just smiled, brushing his thumb across my cheek. "You've said that before," he replied, his confidence infuriating and intoxicating all at once. It wasn't just the physical connection that kept me coming back. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. The way he listened when I talked about work or vented about Greg. The way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. But it was also getting harder to hide. One afternoon, while Chloe was home for the weekend, Ethan stopped by unannounced. He claimed he was dropping off some documents for a project we were working on, but the way his hand lingered on mine as he handed them to me said otherwise. Chloe noticed. "Why are you so friendly with my boyfriend?" she asked later that evening, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "I'm not," I said quickly, brushing off the question with a forced laugh. "He's just grateful for the opportunity at Tempest, that's all." She didn't press further, but the suspicion in her eyes didn't fade. Then there was Caroline, my colleague. She'd always been competitive, the type to pounce on any perceived weakness. I noticed her watching me more closely than usual, her sharp eyes darting between Ethan and me during meetings. "You and Ethan seem awfully close," she said one day, her tone casual but her meaning clear. "We work well together," I replied, forcing a smile. She said, her lips curving into a knowing smirk. "Must be nice to have such dedicated support." I knew then that she was onto something, and if Caroline figured it out, it wouldn't just be my career on the line. Ethan, for his part, wasn't making things any easier. The more time we spent together, the more reckless he became. He'd text me late at night, messages that made my heart race and my stomach churn with guilt. "I can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again?" Once, he showed up at my office in the middle of the day, pulling me into the stairwell when no one was looking. "We're going to get caught," I hissed, trying to pull away. "Doesn't that make it more exciting?" he replied, his lips brushing my ear. It did, and that terrified me. I knew it couldn't last. The cracks were starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. It was the morning of Chloe's birthday when I first realized something was wrong. I'd been feeling off for weeks. Fatigue that wouldn't go away, a strange queasiness in the mornings, and this gnawing sense of unease that I tried to ignore. I stood in the kitchen, icing the cake Chloe had requested, when the smell of the frosting hit me like a punch to the stomach. I barely made it to the bathroom before I was doubled over the toilet, dry heaving until my ribs ached. I sat on the floor afterward, staring at the tiles as the pieces began to fall into place. I'd brushed it off as stress, maybe a bug that wouldn't quit. But in that moment, I knew. I was pregnant. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Chloe's friends came over, Greg kept himself busy with work emails even as we sang happy birthday, and Ethan hovered in the background, smiling and charming like nothing was wrong. I avoided his gaze, barely able to look at him without my stomach twisting. I wanted to pull him aside, to tell him what I suspected, but the thought of saying it out loud made me feel like I was choking. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I slipped out of the house and drove to the nearest drugstore. The cashier didn't even look up as he scanned the test, and I couldn't decide if that made me feel better or worse. When I got home, I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at the little white stick as it confirmed what I already knew. Positive. The room felt like it was spinning. My first thought was Greg, but then I remembered we hadn't been intimate in months. It wasn't his. It couldn't be. It was Ethan's. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do. My marriage, my career, my family, everything was on the line now. And yet, a small, treacherous part of me couldn't ignore the way my heart raced at the thought of Ethan. What would he say? How would he react? The next day I asked him to meet me in the park near my office. It was a quiet spot, tucked away from prying eyes, and I couldn't risk having this conversation anywhere else. When he arrived, he looked as confident as ever, his usual smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. But when he saw my face, his expression shifted. "What's wrong?" he asked, stepping closer. I didn't know how to say it, so I just blurted it out. "I'm pregnant." He froze, his eyes widening as the words sank in. For a moment he didn't say anything, and I braced myself for anger, for fear, for anything but the look of joy that spread across his face. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice almost disbelieving. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "That's incredible," he said, a grin breaking across his face. "Incredible?" I hissed, my voice sharp with panic. "Ethan, this isn't good. This is a disaster." His smile faltered, but only slightly. "Why? We'll figure it out. We can make this work." "Make it work?" I stared at him, incredulous. "Ethan, I'm married. You're dating my daughter. How the hell do we make this work?" "We'll figure it out," he said again, louder, his tone more insistent this time. "You're not alone in this, Miriam. I'm here. I'm with you." But that was the problem, wasn't it? No matter how much he wanted to believe we could make this work, the reality was far more complicated. Over the next few weeks, the weight of the secret grew heavier. Ethan became more possessive, texting me constantly and finding excuses to pull me aside at work. He wanted to talk about the baby, what we would do, how we would tell people, but I shut him down every time. "We're not telling anyone," I said one evening after he cornered me in the office parking lot. "Not yet." "Why not?" he demanded, his frustration boiling over. "Miriam, this is happening whether we like it or not. Don't you think we should at least?" "No," I snapped, cutting him off. "I need time to figure this out, Ethan. You don't understand what's at stake here." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly, as if that could fix everything. But it didn't. Chloe, meanwhile, was starting to notice the cracks. She'd always been perceptive, and it was only a matter of time before she picked up on the tension between Ethan and me. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, she cornered me in the kitchen. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "You've seemed off lately," she continued, crossing her arms. "And Ethan's been acting weird too. Is something going on? I froze, my heart pounding as I struggled to keep my expression neutral. What are you talking about? I don't know, she said, shrugging. Just, something feels off. I laughed, the sound hollow even to my own ears. You're imagining things, Chloe. Everything's fine. But the suspicion in her eyes didn't fade. And then, there was Caroline. She'd been circling like a shark for weeks, her sharp eyes catching every little slip-up. One afternoon, as I was leaving a meeting, she pulled me aside, her smile thin and full of meaning. You and Ethan seem to spend a lot of time together, she said, her tone light but pointed. We're working on a project, I replied, my voice steady despite the panic bubbling under the surface. Of course, she said, tilting her head. Just, be careful, Miriam. People talk. The threat was clear and it left me shaking long after she walked away. The final straw came when Ethan showed up at my house unannounced. It was late, Greg was out of town, and Chloe was upstairs in her room. You can't keep showing up like this, I hissed, dragging him inside before anyone could see. I needed to see you, he said, his voice raw with emotion. Miriam, we need to figure this out. I can't keep pretending like nothing's happening. We don't have a choice, I snapped. Yes, we do, he said, stepping closer. We could tell them, we could. No, I said, my voice rising. You don't understand, Ethan. This isn't just about us. This is about Chloe, about Greg, about everything I've spent my life building. And what about the baby? He demanded. Doesn't that matter? His words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. You need to leave, I said finally, my voice trembling. He stared at me for a long moment before nodding. Fine, but this isn't over. As the door closed behind him, I sank to the floor, my chest tight with panic. I knew he was right. This wasn't over, and the worst was yet to come. The walls came crashing down on a Sunday evening. Chloe had gone out earlier in the day, telling me she was running errands. I thought nothing of it. She often spent her Sundays shopping or catching up with friends. But when she came home that evening, she wasn't alone. She walked through the door with Ethan trailing behind her, his face pale and tense. Mom, we need to talk, Chloe said, her voice sharp and unrecognizable. My stomach dropped. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but the look in her eyes told me she already knew. About what? I asked, forcing a laugh as I wiped my hands on a dish towel. She didn't respond, instead pulling out her phone and thrusting it toward me. The screen displayed a text thread, my name at the top of the screen. Ethan, I can't stop thinking about you. I need to see you. Me. Not now. Chloe's home, Ethan. I don't care. I'll come over after she goes to bed. My heart stopped. I recognized the messages immediately. They were from weeks ago, ones I thought I'd deleted. But somehow Chloe had them. How did you? It doesn't matter how I got them, she snapped, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. What matters is that they're real, aren't they? I opened my mouth to deny it, to say anything that might diffuse the situation, but the words wouldn't come. Chloe's hands were shaking as she gestured toward Ethan, who stood frozen near the door, his eyes darting between us like a cornered animal. You're sleeping with my boyfriend, she said, her voice breaking. Aren't you? Chloe. I started, but she didn't let me finish. Don't lie to me, she screamed, tears streaming down her face. I'm not stupid, Mom. I've seen the way you look at him, the way he looks at you. And now this. She waved her phone in the air. I trusted you. I trusted both of you. The sound of the door opening behind her made my blood run cold. Greg stepped inside, his keys still in his hand, his expression shifting from confusion to shock as he took in the scene. What's going on? He asked, his voice low and wary. Chloe turned to him, her face crumpling. Ask her, she spat, pointing at me. Ask her what she's been doing with Ethan. Greg's eyes snapped to me, his brow furrowing. What is she talking about, Miriam? I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my chest tight, and the weight of their stares pinned me in place. Tell him, Chloe demanded, her voice trembling. Or I will. Ethan stepped forward, his hands raised as if to calm her. Chloe, please let me. Don't you dare, she yelled, turning on him. You don't get to explain anything. You've already said enough. Her words seemed to break something in him. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. We should just tell them the truth. No, I said quickly, my voice finally finding its strength. Ethan, don't. But it was too late. I love her, he said, his voice cracking. The room went silent. Greg stared at him, then at me, his face pale. What the hell is he talking about? It's not what it sounds like, I said, my voice trembling. Greg stepped closer, his jaw tightening. Then what is it, Miriam? Because it sounds like my wife has been screwing my daughter's boyfriend. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. I didn't mean for it to happen, I said, tears streaming down my face. I swear, Greg, I didn't. You didn't mean for it to happen, he shouted, his voice rising. You don't just accidentally sleep with someone else. For God's sake, Miriam, he's half your age. His voice caught, and he turned away, dragging a hand through his hair. Chloe was sobbing now, her face buried in her hands. How could you do this? She whispered. How could you do this to me? Ethan stepped toward her, but she flinched away. Don't, she said sharply. Don't come near me. Don't talk to me. Don't ever look at me again. The sound of glass breaking startled us all. Greg had swept his arm across the counter, sending a stack of dishes crashing to the floor. Get out, he said, his voice low and trembling with rage. Greg. I said get out, he shouted, pointing at the door. Ethan didn't argue. He glanced at me one last time, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking out. The house was eerily quiet after he left. Chloe went upstairs, slamming her door behind her, and Greg stood with his back to me, his hands braced against the counter. I wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but I knew it wouldn't matter. There was nothing I could say that would make this better. After what felt like an eternity, Greg turned to face me. His eyes were cold, his voice flat. I don't even know who you are anymore. He walked past me without another word, disappearing into the living room. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling and replaying the night's events over and over. The gravity of what I'd done weighed on me like a stone, suffocating and unrelenting. The next morning, Greg was gone. Chloe barely looked at me as she left for class, her face pale and puffy from crying. And me? I was left with the wreckage of a life I'd spent decades building. The house was silent the next morning, the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive. Greg's car was still in the driveway, but he was nowhere to be found. Chloe had locked herself in her room, ignoring my knocks and calls through the door. I sat in the kitchen, staring at my untouched coffee, my mind racing. Every instinct told me the truth would come out eventually. Greg wasn't the type to let this slide. Chloe wasn't the type to forget. And Ethan was a wild card. I had to act. Greg finally emerged late in the afternoon. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn. He looked at me like I was a stranger, and in that moment, I realized I didn't recognize him either. We need to talk, I said, my voice soft but steady. He didn't respond, just pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Greg, I paused, choosing my words carefully. I made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. Unforgivable? He echoed, his voice hollow. That's putting it mildly. I swallowed hard, pushing down the lump in my throat. You're right, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even deserve to be sitting here right now. But I need you to understand why this happened. His jaw clenched, but he didn't stop me. For years I've felt invisible. I continued, my voice trembling. You've been so focused on work, on everything else, that I started to feel like I didn't matter anymore. Like we didn't matter anymore. And that's supposed to justify what you did? He snapped. No, I said quickly, shaking my head. It doesn't. Nothing justifies what I did. But I wasn't looking for an affair, Greg. I wasn't looking for him. It just happened. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And Chloe? How do you think she's supposed to feel about this? You didn't just betray me, Miriam. You betrayed her too. I felt the sting of his words like a physical blow, but I forced myself to stay composed. I know, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to her. But I need your help, Greg. I need us to get through this together. Together? He repeated, his voice bitter. You think we can just sweep this under the rug and move on like nothing happened? No, I said softly. But we can rebuild. For Chloe's sake, for our family's sake, we can try. Convincing him wasn't easy. He spent days barely speaking to me, sleeping in the guest room and avoiding me at every turn. But slowly, piece by piece, I started to put the plan into motion. First, I reached out to Ethan. I waited until Chloe was out of the house, then called him, my heart pounding as I listened to the phone ring. When he finally picked up, his voice was cold. "What do you want, Miriam?" "We need to talk," I said, my tone firm. "I think we've said everything that needs to be said." "No," I said, my voice sharp. "You need to stay away from Chloe, from me, from my family. This ends now." "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice rising. "You think you can just cut me out like this?" "Yes," I said, my grip tightening on the phone. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might fight back. But then he sighed, the anger in his voice replaced by something softer. "Fine, you win." And just like that, he was gone. Next, I turned my attention to Chloe. She refused to speak to me for days, barely acknowledging my presence even when we were in the same room. But I didn't push her. Instead, I focused on damage control, telling her that Ethan had admitted to being unfaithful and that I'd ended any professional ties with him. She didn't believe me at first. Why would he cheat on me? Why would he, with you? "Because he's young and stupid," I said, my voice steady despite the guilt clawing at my chest. "Because he didn't know what he wanted, and because I made a terrible mistake letting him get too close. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough to plant the seed of doubt." Greg was harder to sway. He stayed distant, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. But I reminded him of what we had built together, of the life we'd created for Chloe. Slowly he began to soften, though I knew the cracks in our marriage would never fully heal. One night as we sat in the living room in silence, he finally spoke. "I'm staying," he said, his voice low and weary. I looked up, startled. "What?" "For Chloe," he clarified, his eyes meeting mine. "I'm staying because she doesn't deserve to lose both of us over this." I nodded, tears filling my eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said sharply. "This doesn't mean I forgive you. It just means I'm willing to try, for her." The weeks that followed were a blur of strained conversations and tentative steps toward rebuilding. Chloe eventually moved back to her apartment, though her texts were short and infrequent. Greg started spending more time at home, but the distance between us remained. A constant reminder of the damage I'd done. And Ethan? He disappeared completely. I heard through mutual connections that he'd taken a freelance contract out of state, far enough that I wouldn't have to worry about running into him. But his absence didn't erase the weight of what had happened. Now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel the baby moving inside me, a constant reminder of the choices I made and the secrets I'll carry to my grave. Greg doesn't know. Chloe doesn't know. And as far as they're concerned, this child is the product of a marriage we're still trying to repair. I tell myself I did what I had to do to protect my family. But in the quiet moments when the house is still and the guilt creeps in, I wonder if I'm protecting anyone at all, or just prolonging the inevitable. Because secrets like this don't stay buried forever.